Thank you so much. I will skip the pleasantries because I know that there are going to be some very hungry people in the room, but suffice to say it's a real honor to be invited back here to a place that, you know, relatively compared to everywhere that I've been before, has contributed to my development as a scholar and also as a human being. So it's a real honor and a privilege to be able to give back in however way that I can. So hopefully this brief lecture here will provide a kind of overview of the kind of path towards mastery in Islamic calligraphy. And I'm very aware that most of the members of the audience are current students here, so it's kind of catered towards people that are involved in practice and also people that are involved in research and are seeking to combine the two in some kind of way. So I thought I would begin by talking about what led me to the topic, I suppose, following the completion of my master's degree was, so as Emma mentioned, I suppose I came from a very strong research background, a very strong academic background, which answers a certain amount of questions about material culture, about Islamic art, or about art in general. But there are, I suppose, certain limits to that, right? And so on a trip to Istanbul, you know, I went to a graveyard once, and I was very interested in calligraphy before I did my PhD anyway. And there were some burial places of calligraphers there, very famous calligraphers, Sheikh Hamdullah and a number of his students and artistic descendants. And the students were buried next to their masters, right? Which was like a really fascinating thing for me. I couldn't really make sense of it. But I thought it was really interesting that the students would choose to be buried with their masters ahead of their own spouses, ahead of their own children, sometimes ahead of their own Sufi sheikhs, right? However, the relationship between the two was based on a transmission of knowledge of what we would say is quote unquote art, right? So it's something unfathomable when you kind of go into the history of art, right? So I started thinking, well, what on earth is going on here, right? As a researcher, the kind of bells are ringing. You're thinking this seems like a very fascinating topic to look at. But of course, in order to understand that, you really have to go into the depths of Islamic calligraphy. So you can, of course, do that from an art historical perspective. You can go to the library, you can get all the books on calligraphy, you can kind of study the letters one by one and try to see if you can be a connoisseur and find the differences between the different scripts and follow what an art historian says is good and what an art historian says is bad writing. But first of all, that will never happen, right? That even if you did it for 30 years, you wouldn't be able to appreciate those subtleties, right? That's just a fundamental truth of any kind of traditional craft, right? And so the real way to delve into that, to really understand it, is through experience, right? There's like a saying in Arabic, Is'al mujarrib wala tas'al tabib, right? Ask the one with experience, don't ask the physician, right? If you really want to know how it feels, right? And so the Prince's School offered a bridge between the two, because it allowed me to kind of really explore this tradition by apprenticing myself to a master and then tasting the kind of aches and frustrations of the apprentice, learning what calligraphy really looks like, you know, over time learning the subtle differences between different scripts and things like that. Because if someone had said to you, like, this is beauty, like without going into the tradition, without learning it properly, you wouldn't know beauty if it was like handed to you on a skewer with chili sauce on the side. Like you would not be able to know at all. It would be like completely foreign to you. So this is kind of like tracing that journey, I suppose, and how it helps you as a researcher, thinking about the students that are based here, how research and practice can come together in kind of harmony, and what that contributes to your development as artists and as young scholars. So just to, you know, again, I'm aware that this is going to be a very new topic for some people in the room, so I'm just going to give a super cursory overview of what Ottoman calligraphy is, because this is the tradition that we're talking about today. So the story of Islamic calligraphy in general begins with the revelation of the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad in 610, not 622, sorry, in 610. And the kind of chronology of the codex, or the chronology of Islamic calligraphy, is something that is being constantly revised with new discoveries, right? So it's different if you base it on the Islamic sources or on archaeological sources, but generally we can say that the mushaf, as we come to know it, or writing on some kind of paper which is bound together into some kind of codex, begins in the 7th century. That process begins with the Ma'il script, or otherwise known as the Hijazi script, which is a collective term used to define a number of different scripts which have these qualities of leaning to the right. And that goes through subsequent stages of development over the next century or two into the formal scripts that we call under the banner of the Kufic script. So these will be very familiar to people that have looked at early Islamic manuscripts. So it goes through various stages up until the kind of late 10th century and early 11th century, when it goes through a process of codification, right? So generally we can say that these Kufic scripts before this period were used for Qur'ans, or things of very like religious nature. So you might find inscriptions, for example, in the Kufic script. And scripts like this, which are called the kind of cursory scripts or the round scripts perhaps, they were generally used for administrative texts, right? So they might be used by the chancery or accountants or people that are doing tax records, the things that we call today thuluth and naskh and the aqlam al-sitta, the 6 scripts. But then around this time, under some luminaries like Ibn Muqla and Ibn al-Bawwab, these chancery scripts were refined and they were codified based on a very strict proportional system. And then these chancery scripts were then applied to the Qur'an. So we can see, for those for those in the room that can read Arabic, that something like this is a lot more difficult to read off the cuff than something like this, right? It's a lot more legible to everyone. It's got the harakat, it's a lot more open, one can distinguish between the different letters, it's got the nuqat. And so this style of writing, you know, was then further refined and codified over the years by further luminaries like Yaqut al-Mustatsimi, who's this individual on the right. And it's generally handed down through this kind of master-student relationship system, right? So if we're talking about the Ottoman period, the very first Ottoman calligraphers were writing in the style that was codified or developed by Yaqut al-Mustatsimi, who's this kind of very late Abbasid calligrapher. And so in the 15th century, according to the Ottoman sources, Sultan Bayezid II then selects the court calligrapher, Sheikh Hamdullah, who's a very spiritual man, part of a number of Sufi orders, incredible archer and the most gifted calligrapher at the time. He says to him, can we make a new style which is unique to us instead of imitating the style of Yaqut al-Mustatsimi? And so Sheikh Hamdullah develops this new style in the manner that is typical for innovation in traditional art and in calligraphy in particular, which is you take the style of writing or the style of art from your predecessor and you build upon it. You don't kind of push it to the side, right? You take the best elements of that and then you add something new or something different, right? To be honest, it kind of reflects the idea of the Qur'an itself, right? Which kind of works by taking the best of what came before. It doesn't reject Judaism, it doesn't reject Christianity, it doesn't reject the Hanif. It takes the truth from those elements, but it also has something which is unique to Islam also. This is the same way for innovation in calligraphy in general, right? So Sheikh Hamdullah is given all of the manuscripts of Yaqut al-Mustatsimi from the Imperial Library. According to the Ottoman sources, he goes into khalwa. He goes into some kind of spiritual retreat with all of these documents. And then he tries to develop a new script. It doesn't work, right? Olmio, right? It doesn't work. And then he remains in the spiritual retreat, and then it's said in the sources that Khidr, this kind of prophetic figure who's mentioned in the Qur'an as the one who, I mean, it's attributed to Khidr, is the one who kind of initiates Moses into the realm of mystery. And this is his role. He's this kind of undying prophetic figure. He takes Sheikh Hamdullah by the hand, and this new kind of script emerges, and it's considered to be greater than anything that ever came before, right? And the style of Yaqut al-Mustatsimi is phased out, and then Sheikh Hamdullah's style generally takes precedence in the Ottoman period. And then again, the same process continues. He kind of teaches this style to his students, who teach it to their students, and then in the late 17th century, another calligrapher comes along, Hafiz Usman, who does the same thing, takes the best of Sheikh Hamdullah, creates something new. And then every 100 years or so, there is this kind of great mujaddid or renewer or reviver of calligraphy who does this kind of thing, right? So generally, the tradition is always passed down from master to student. This is like a typical silsila, like a genealogy of calligraphy, which stretches over like 30 or 40 pages. And And then if we're talking about the modern period, so there's, in the Ottoman tradition, there's a number of calligraphers who were born in the Ottoman Empire, and then they continued to practice following the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish Republic. So they kind of continued the Ottoman style. And because it was master to student, it could never be controlled by an institution, right? So this is why a lot of the codes of ethics, the kind of aesthetic attributes, the visual attributes couldn't be dominated from any outside interference, right? Because even when it was moved into the kind of university or the academy, still it was based on master and the student, right, working side by side. So this is Hamid Aytaç, who's kind of a late Ottoman, early Republican calligrapher who taught Hasan Çelebi Hoca. Hasan Çelebi Hoca is the teacher of Süreyya, for example, one of the teachers of Süreyya Hoca, who's sitting with us. And he taught, Hasan Çelebi Hoca taught Efdaluddin Kılıç, who's my teacher. And this is the way that the kind of silsila passes. This is the way that calligraphy develops over time. So the way that one learns calligraphy nowadays, and as it was in the past, is that one approaches the teacher with a request. So, may I be your student? It's not as formalized as it was in the past. Generally, people are quite open today compared to how it was before. But in the past, we know that the teacher could say no to the student, or the teacher could reject the student based on an assessment of the character of the student. So sometimes it does happen now, right? Certain teachers say it's just not going to work between you and I. So one very famous example, of course, is Mahmud Jalaluddin, who's this late Ottoman calligrapher who was rejected by a number of teachers based on his obstinate character. He was considered a very stubborn character, so it's very difficult to mold an apprentice like that. And it's also a very important decision, this initial decision, because once you choose a master, you can never go to another teacher until your master dies. This is the way that it was in the past, and this is the way that it is now, right? Unless you have your teacher's permission to go and learn from another teacher. So it's a really important decision in the life of the apprentice, because this is your guide for life. And then when you die, you know, you may even be buried next to each other, and then there's some, you know, really intimate notes between the two where they talk about, you know, the master says, I will not even enter heaven without you, to the apprentice. You know, they're going to take them by the hand and enter heaven together. An amazing tradition. So the first thing the teacher does is to write out this kind of dua, or Rabbi Yassir, right? O Lord, make it easy, do not make it difficult. O Lord, may it end in goodness. And then the instructor will, in front of the student, will put these different signs or isharas, right, next to the letters. So the student is aware of, this is by, so the top one is the lower one is by Mehmet Özçay, and I think the top one is Uthman Özçay, two contemporary calligraphers. And then so the student is aware that this is a system which is constructed upon some kind of rule, right? It's a rule-based system. So immediately the student is aware that my teacher follows a system and I have to follow this system. I can't just do it based on my own aesthetic interests, right? I really have to follow this particular way. And then the student is expected to then go home and practice, right? This is what this is a very beautiful practice sheet, but generally this is called a karalama, which means to blacken, because the page should be blackened with strokes of writing. And so the student has to then go away and try to imitate the line of writing to the best of his or her ability. So I will just give a kind of example here. So this is the one that my teacher wrote for me many years ago, 2013, so a decade ago, and you can see the teacher has appended this thing with all of the nuqat and kind of signed it at the bottom. And this would be the first attempt after a week of me trying to imitate that writing, right? And one can see below, these are all of the mistakes that the teacher has pointed out, right? So just to go deeper into the mistakes, so one can see the kind of detail. So this would be the teacher's original drawing on the left, and the student's attempt, which is my attempt, in the middle. So the teacher has put this kind of serrated line to show that the angle of this letter is too far to the left. And then this teacher has rewritten the stroke to show that actually it should be, the degree should be more to the right slightly. So this is enough to warrant, you know, a significant number of mistakes here are enough to warrant like a repetition, we can say, right? So there's So here's just and also just to show some of the practice sheets. It's actually quite nostalgic to look at these, because you feel like I was so much more hardworking back then, you know, trying so hard to impress the teacher, and then that kind of feeling fades away over time. It's quite sad, actually. and then looking at this and then you kind of slowly build up and try to do try to put the nuqat and try to build the letters and then try to kind of produce something. So here's another example of a mistake. So again, the teacher's writing on the left, and then my attempt in the middle. So again, the teacher has shown that this is not one, right? It should be one, but actually it's one and a bit, right? So you need to change that. So the teacher has again shown the correct, here's just some examples from the Ottoman period to show that this is not something new. This is the way that it was done in the past also, right? One can see this is possibly by Haji Nazif Bey of Hamid Aytaç's writing, right? So if you do well, then the teacher will kind of circle the good parts and say, okay, this part is okay here. But usually there'll be something like this, tekrar, which means like do it again, right? So do it again, do it again, do it again. So traditionally the Rabbi Yasir, this first, you can see here, for example, there's like a mistake on every single part of this, right? So of course you won't be able to move on. You've got to do this many, many times. So the Rabbi Yasir typically takes about a year, right? Which is like 52. If you come every week, it's like doing it 52 times. The one on the top, yeah. So Hamid Aytaç said, like, even if you were Pablo Picasso, you would have to do this for a year, right? It doesn't matter how good you are. And so, but once you kind of move on, the typical way of progressing is you have criticism, then repetition, and then correction, and then you move on. This is the cycle of learning in this kind of ijaza system, right? So typically to get from the start to the finish takes between like 7 and 13 years when you kind of calculate, when you look at in 1 or 2 scripts, right? For every script would take about 7 to 13 years, right? This is the Ottoman way. So this is how we know this from the biographical dictionaries. So once you finish the initial one, then you'll move on to the single letters, the huruf. Then you move on to the double letter combinations, which is the equivalent of B to A, B to C, B to D, etc., etc. You go through the entire alphabet. And then during this time, of course, you should only study with your teacher. But one of the interesting things in the Ottoman period is that they were very fond of the majlis, which is like a great thing to think about in the modern context of producing art. So the majlis was where, and they still do this now, here's just some photos. So every week, a kind of calligrapher will host students and host other masters. And this is a kind of safe space for criticism. So you often see great masters coming in with their latest works and they discuss works, and the students are just meant to watch. You shouldn't really do anything. You should just keep your mouth shut and just watch and learn from other people what they're doing. But in the Ottoman period, it's also described in the biographical sources as ways for students to progress, is to see how criticism works. So just don't try and have an opinion, but just try to figure things out, right? Try to learn and just watch. This is something that is missing, the kind of artistic salon, I suppose, where you leave your feelings at the door and everyone just has like a really interesting discussion. So this is something that is also kind of really encouraged when you're a student, is to just watch, right? Just without saying anything. So then as you progress, you tend to notice the criticism become more precise, more detailed. The teacher is very aware of what you're capable of and what you're not capable of. And sometimes they're using these amazing things like visual similes to kind of show the different shapes of things. So this is some of the ways that the students progresses, right? Another way is to, at the same time you're connecting to your teachers in an artistic way, but sometimes you're encouraged to kind of go to people in your silsila perhaps, or kind of go to the graveyards to develop some kind of spiritual connection to the people in the past, right? So you might go to, you can see here the calligraphers go to certain graves every year, for example. Mehmet Shevki Efendi, who's one of the great calligraphers we named our son after. He's like a really big figure for us. 19th century calligrapher. He was known, for example, every Friday he would visit the people in, his master, his master's master, his master's master's master, right? And that was a great way to connect with that kind of tradition, to feel like you're part of something. Sometimes they also have like a, sorry, let me find the right slide. Sometimes there's like different rituals that people are encouraged to do. I don't think this is something which is done so much nowadays, but in the past it's something which was really encouraged, which was to bury your pens in the graves of other master calligraphers. The idea being that these old masters have a lot of barakah in their graves, and you should bury your pens in there and then take them out a week later. So actually when I go to do this sometimes, you can see the pens are still there, right? People are still doing this nowadays. So it's based on some of the old sources, textual sources, which I've kind of put. This is from a 18th century source, Tuhfei Hattatin, and he basically explains the process. So he says, to the new students that are out there, you should begin by doing like a Fatiha, which is like a prayer from the Quran, and dedicate the reward of that prayer to Shaykh Hamdullah, who was this charismatic figure we mentioned earlier. And then look at the practice sheets that your teacher gives you, right? And then you should take 2 new pens, one for thuluth, one for naskh, and then you should wrap them in a piece of paper, right, with prayers and exaltations and blessings on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then you should bury the pen in the grave at a depth of about 2 feet, 2 fingers deep, horizontally, right? And then you should do that on a Friday night, keep it there for a week, and then you take it out. And then basically any time you do a composition, the first line should be done with this pen that you buried in the grave, and then the rest you can use another pen. So the reason being is you get to save that pen, you don't have to keep cutting it, but you're able to transmute the barakah, the blessings from the grave into all the work that you produce, right? Everything that you do is now blessed with that kind of charismatic presence of the sheikh, whoever's grave you bury the pen in, right? So that's like a really fascinating tradition to think about when we go to galleries nowadays, actually, when we go to museums and galleries and stuff, because all of these things that are infused into these pieces, they don't really come into your mind, actually, when you go to visit these objects, right? We kind of see them as stale, behind the glass, there's nothing beyond the frame. But actually, the more we go into the sources, this is just one example of many in terms of rituals that people were doing. Then we come to realize that these objects really meant something to these individuals. It's kind of sad when you see them locked away in like some private collector's ownership, right? Thinking about all of these meanings that went into this particular object. So just to zoom through, once you finish all of those letters and stuff like that, then you would move on to sentences. And again, sentences have the same kind of structure as the individual letters. They all have specific rules. And so, when one goes to visit a calligrapher now, for example, you say, oh, please, can you write a Bismillah? They'll just write it for you, and you think, oh, it's, you forget that all of these things have very, very specific rules that have been internalized over years and years and years of practice. So after working on the sentences, again, the kind of corrections continue. Then one is finally given an ijazah. So once the teacher is comfortable with the student's progress, both as a calligrapher and potentially also as a human being, then the student is granted an artistic license or ijazah, right? So like I said, in the Ottoman period, this may be between 7 and 13 years. And this particular document will be signed by the teacher as well as a number of other teachers, right? A minimum of 2. And here we actually have a photo of one of the graduation ceremonies in the very, very late Ottoman period at the Madrasatul Hattatin, or Madrasa of Calligraphers. And here's an example of an ijazah text, which was actually given to someone called Ismail Hakkabay, a very famous late Ottoman calligrapher. And you can see if you follow the text, you can see that the typical way the text is, it says, I give the right of writing the kataba. So this is the first time that the student is allowed to ever write his or her own name on a text, right? After this period of study. For they write katabahu, or he wrote it, or she wrote it if it's a female, and then it gives the name. And then here the ijazah text says, so I give the license to this particular person who's Ismail Hakkabay, and it's actually given to him by his father. So he says qurratu aini, from my eye, and it's given to him by his father. And then he says, I am so and so who was a student of so and so, and then the whole 4 lines is just a silsila. So he just says, وَهُوَ مِن تَلَامِيذ مُصْطَفَى دَدَى وَهُوَ مِن تَلَامِيذ قِبْلَةُ الْكُتَّابِ حَمْدُ اللَّهِ الْمَعْرُوفِ بِإِبْنُ الشَّيْخِ وَهُوَ مِن تَلَامِيذ خَيْرُ الدِّينِ الْمَرْرَاشِ. And then it goes all the way back to Yaqut al-Mustasimi. So the student, and these silsilas were read out aloud in the Ottoman period in the ceremony. So the student, once they graduate into the world of mastery, immediately they're brought down back to earth. They get the idea that they are not some new, they're not hot stuff, right? So they immediately understand that they're connected to something, that they're a recipient of something, and they have a responsibility to protect and conserve what has been passed down to them. Interestingly, they were also graduated in the same ceremony as the Huffaz. So people that memorized the Quran were graduated in the same ceremony as people that became calligraphers. The reason being that both of these individuals, we forget before the age of modern printing, both of these individuals are responsible for safeguarding the knowledge of producing the Quran. One is by recitation, the other one is by writing, right? So these two things are kind of synonymous, so you can't really play around with that, right? Just like in qira'ah, just like in recitation, there's ways, there's modes, there's maqams, but there's a solid thing that can't be broken or changed, right? Very similar to calligraphy. So these kinds of silsilas were really, really important in the Ottoman tradition. So now moving on to the kind of second half. So once you graduate into the world of mastery, that relationship between the master and student is never cut. That kind of continues, up until death, and then you become a teacher. You also become responsible for someone else, right? So it's actually a drawing, a late Turkish Republican period drawing of someone who depicted Mehmet Shevki Effendi and his student. It's actually from the family of Suhail Unver, was the grandson of Mehmet Shevki Effendi, and I think the artist was somehow involved in that family in some kind of way. So this is like the typical kind of setup. People were not sitting on tables as we do now. People are sitting on the floor writing on one knee. And so now what does it mean to be a master, right? We've talked about what it means to be a student, but now what does it mean to be a master? Well, the primary distinction of mastery in calligraphy is that ijazah, like one should never forget, it's actually an ijazah to teach. This is the thing about, actually ijazahs in all of the classical Islamic sciences, it's an ijazah to teach something. It's not an ijazah to hold something. It doesn't mean anything if you hold it to yourself and you don't teach it, right? This is what the ijazah is in calligraphy. So first and foremost, you're defined as a teacher, as a mu'allim, and it's your responsibility to then pass this on to the next generation. And the relationship between the master and the student is one of both giving this student a particular form of knowledge, but also pastoral care, right? Ensuring that this particular individual becomes a good person. It's about character formation, it's about ethics, right? Can you leave this person in a good state, right? Is this person's state commensurate with the sanctity of the knowledge that you're giving them? That's like a really big thing. And so here we have, it is actually an example of the master and the student buried next to each other. This is Mehmet Shevki Effendi and his master Hulusi Effendi buried next to each other. So we have some letters actually from Mehmet Shevki Effendi, really fascinating things where they show that the teacher is continuing to correspond with the student after mastery, and sometimes the students become sick and they need some money, they need some medicine, or sometimes the student has some financial problems, the teacher will help the student out. Sometimes they're struggling with a composition, and this correspondence describes this back and forth. So even after they're grown men and this kind of phase of learning is over, they're continuing that kind of relationship, almost like a father figure. So now we can come closer to understanding the kind of being buried next to each other, right? Almost like there's something powerful going on there between the two. And one should also not forget that calligraphy in those times was really a young person's game. It's like nowadays we're learning in our 20s, right? If we're lucky in our teens, but generally 20s. But when you look at the ijazah certificates and the biographies, generally they were like young teenagers. Mehmet Shevki Effendi got the ijazah when he was like 12 or 13. And so all these, they were already masters by the time they were 13, 14 years old. And then they had already become fluent in like Arabic and Persian and Turkish, and they knew qira'ah, they knew like some basic fiqh, some basic hadith. And so by the time they were like our age, they were like grandmasters, and on a general level, right? They already had like, a couple silsilas of students going. So by this age, they were like really like, the level of discussion that they had and criticism was incomparable to what we have nowadays. So again, it helps us to now understand at that kind of young age, if they were graduating in the early teens, they were starting at around 8 years old, 7 years old. And now you can again understand this, how the relationship, the bond develops between the two, because we can't imagine it now. If I go to like a grown man now, you're already a grown man, right? You think you know enough about the world to take something from this particular individual, but in that time it was very different. So another key thing I just want to talk about, which was a fascinating thing that I was looking at recently for a publication, was the enactment of dua. So how is artistic success measured, right? So when we're looking at the biographical dictionaries, we can see, these are just some names of the biographical dictionaries, we can see that the students really believed that if the master did a good dua for them, a good prayer for them, then they would become good calligraphers. And so they would do everything they could to earn the master's favor. And generally, the way that you could earn the master's favor is from like devotion, fidelity, obedience, service, love, expressions of respect. If you could do this, then you would earn the kind of blessed prayer. And so it's always like this. There's always the kind of, when you look at the formulas in the biographical dictionaries, it's always like, this person did this through acts of obedience, submission and reverence. Or in the case of Yaqut al-Mustatsimi, the student prepared like good food for the teacher and he earned the prayer, and then the student became successful. So like a really famous example is from Hafiz Usman, who's one of the greatest calligraphers ever. So he would walk like nearly 8 miles to take lessons from his teacher, one day walking barefoot in the snow to kind of show his respect for the teacher. And very famously, there was like a gathering of dignitaries, and Hafiz Usman's teacher was there, and Hafiz Usman was there himself. And the Quran that Hafiz Usman wrote was being passed around the dignitaries. So the Sadrazam was there, the Grand Vizier, the second in command after the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And then the Grand Vizier said, who wrote this incredible Quran that is written here? And instead of saying me, like I did it, he said, I am a graduate of His Effendi Hazret Derinden Me'zunum. Like I am and pointing to his teacher saying like, I'm a graduate of this person, right? As a way of signifying himself, but also I'm only a product of this guy. And then the teacher outside, it said that in the source, it says then outside the teacher kisses Hafiz Usman on the forehead. He's so honored by this kind of expression and does this kind of da'avati hayri, this dua for the student, right? And so it's an amazing thing because it's like amazing triangulation between like artistic identity is not based on the self, right? It's really based on God as the one that bestows the blessings, right? And the master who gives the dua and the calligrapher, him or herself, right? So it really makes us think like beyond the ego. When we're talking about ego and the self, these people really believed that. It wasn't like something for show, right? They really believed in this thing, and this is why it emerges in the textual sources so much, right? One really fascinating thing about the textual sources is they're written contemporaneous with the calligraphers that they're talking about. So there's no room to lie, or because there's a lot of good stuff that is said about it, but sometimes it's bad stuff too. Sometimes this calligrapher was a bit mean or harsh or cruel, but because they were talking about their contemporaries, so there's no embellishment here. That's the amazing thing about the Ottoman sources. They're just writing about people that they met, and those people could read it and they didn't hide it, right? So it's an amazing thing to read. So we'll just skip through. These are just some further, for people that are interested in this kind of stuff, there's some articles that you can find online. I'm happy to share these on which I published about these particular topics, which go into detail with examples and references and sources and stuff like that. So just to give an example of the opposite, so that you could also have something called a bed dua, which is like a negative dua. So if you betray the master, if you do something bad to the master, if you're rude to the master, then the master could do a prayer and you would be crushed, right? So sometimes, like, once in the Minaqib Hunar Varan, 16th century text, the student disrespects the master does dua and the student becomes blind, for example. Or another example, again, Hafiz Usman related, which is in the Tuhfe Hattatin. There's someone called Mehmet Dervish Kebkeb Effendi, who's from a place in Turkey called Edirne. And in those days, when you were writing a mushaf, when you were writing a whole Quran, you would write a certain amount of it, and then it would be sent to like a muzahib, like a illuminator. and then the illuminator would polish it and do the illumination on it, whatever it might be, and then it would get sent to a bookbinder, right? So the bookbinder can start to sew the pages together. And so you would write it like that. So Hafiz Usman, this great master, is earns a commission from someone, starts sending the pages to Istanbul, and then this Dervish Kebkeb Effendi, this particular individual here, basically hijacks the commission from his teacher, and he says to the person, I can actually do it for you in a much shorter amount of time and better, because Hafiz Usman in his later life, he was paralyzed, he suffered paralysis, so he was quite much slower in writing things, and so he hijacked the commission. And when Hafiz Usman found out about it, he was so heartbroken that the student would do this, but he didn't curse the student, he just, Hafiz Usman, he was a Hafiz of course, and he just kind of said this Quranic verse, which is God erases or confirms whatever he will, and the source of scripture is with him, right? Just as a reminder that this is the true source of the Quran. And it said in the textual source, again, which is written in the time of Dervish Kebkeb Effendi, that Kebkeb Effendi sliced his fingers open when he was cutting the pen, and then he lost the commission because his hand couldn't heal for him to write the commission. So there's like an amazing thing there when we think about the power of dua. It's something which is, we don't really believe in it, I suppose, so much, but interesting story. Dua is like a prayer, like a prayer for a particular thing. This is what a dua is. I'm very aware. So we'll just end on this actually. Maybe we can just end with some closing remarks. So just to kind of give a kind of general idea of why is this the case, right? Returning back to this thing that we talked about in the beginning, like why is it the case that students are buried next to their teachers? Why is character formation necessary in the craft? Why is that a big thing? Nowadays, again, it might seem like something unnecessary, but I suppose to people that believe in a spiritual realm, or people that believe in God, people that believe in tajalli or self-disclosure of the divine, or the idea that beauty is a reflection of God's beauty, there's like one of the things that all craftsmen aim for is to kind of capture some kind of element of that divine beauty. That's the ultimate goal of every kind of craftsman, is to kind of get something which may even mirror a modicum of that beauty, right? And so, nature is the ultimate reflection of that in some way, and art is why art, of course, is very much related to nature. But without the self being polished, how would you even recognize that beauty? That's the ultimate question, right? So this is why there is this real importance on the formation of character, right? Because you will not be able to understand beauty at all, right? And so this is the first thing, how it's related to aesthetics. Character and aesthetics are related in a very significant way. So the second reason why is because in general, calligraphy is considered a form of ilm. So nowadays it's something which you'll find in a book on Islamic art and architecture. But in the Islamic tradition, it's considered to be a form of ilm, right? So ilm meaning knowledge in Arabic, and it's a term which is applied to the Islamic sciences. So things like hadith, fiqh, tasawwuf, all these kinds of different traditions. And so the reason why it's considered to be a form of ilm is because according to the kind of classical definitions and the syllogisms that are given in the Ottoman sources, knowledge is defined as something which gives you an idea of things as they really are. And if you understand things as they really are, then you understand that everything is a reflection of, or a manifestation of God's reality. That's the ultimate goal of, ultimate level of gnosis, I suppose, is to see that God is reality, right? That's what knowledge gives you. And so all of these things, like trying to be, for example, character formation, following the hadith, following the Quran, is to be in accordance with the things as they should be, and to be able to see things as they really are, to act in the way that God wants you to act. So calligraphy is considered to be one of those things because, first and foremost, it's there to write the Quran, right, which ensures the subsistence of Islam as a religion. And we also find these really fascinating things. This is just one snapshot. These are kind of recommendations of how to be a good calligrapher from the Ottoman period. So here would be an example of where he says you should be a good person, you should follow the sunnah, you should also write works, you should look at the people of your time, try to understand what they're doing, try to look at Muslims around you, right? And see what the needs are of the Muslim community, right? And then you should write sayings according to those needs, right? So don't just write the same things over. That's not what he says here. So he says you should write the sayings of, for example, Ali ibn Abi Talib or the four Khalifs or Mubarak Qasida, they're like blessed poems or odes. And so we can see it's very much in line. People were thinking about calligrapher as someone in line with like an Islamic scholar, right? Which is what the Va'iz does, the kind of, the Khatib, the guy who stands up and gives the Friday sermon every week. What is he supposed to do? See what his community needs and speak accordingly, right? This is the same thing as a calligrapher. So calligraphers were put into that category, into that box, right? And so naturally, as with all forms of ilm, as with all forms of Islamic knowledge, you have to have a character which is commensurate with the blessedness of that particular form of knowledge. So this is just, I thought I'd end with this amazing, like a couplet here, which I just came across the other day, which is, he says, Veli ilmu huner dunyada çoktur, and there are many forms of knowledge and many forms of craft in this world. Bu ilmi hatta gibi zibası yoktur, but there is nothing that compares to the beauty or the blessedness of calligraphy, right? And I think it really encapsulates some of the kind of key things that we discussed today. So I will leave it there, but thank you very much.